and welcome to episode 117 of Explode Your Expert Biz show, brought to you by gtex.org.uk. I am your host, Simone Vincenzi, the Expert Strategist, and this is the podcast for experts who want to become the ultimate authority in their niche while making an impact in their world. Today, I have the pleasure to interview the one and only Tom Schwab on how to speak directly to ideal prospects with targeted podcast interview marketing. You cannot miss this episode, so make sure you listen to this until the end. Before I'm going to explain what you're going to get in this episode, I want to start, like I do every single time, with the tool of the day. This is a tool that I personally use in my business or in my life that make my life or business better, more productive, more enjoyable, more fun, more profitable. You call it. I'm using those tools. So the tool that I'm using right now is called Trello. Now you might find that you have a lot of projects that are going on, and as a business, sometimes you have multiple things that you're doing at the same time. Or you need to manage a project for your client, you need to manage a project maybe with your team. And I found that Trello is an incredible tool, first of all, because it's free. And second, because it's incredibly easy to use to manage all your projects. Also to manage your calendar, to manage your life, to manage the things that you are doing. And I'm constantly using it in my team meetings with our teams, with our salesperson, with our marketing person, our community manager, and everyone else. So make sure that you check it out. It's called Trello. It's absolutely free. There is also a paid version, but the free version is freaking awesome. So you can get it, and there is the link here in the show notes. Again, there is no affiliation with me and this product. It's just something that I absolutely use every single time, and I completely love. Now, let's go back to the interview, shall we? Yes, let's go back to the interview. Fantastic. So, as I said, in this interview, we are going to talk with Tom Schwab, and Tom knows how to build an online business. Marketing at its heart is starting a conversation with someone who could be an ideal customer. Tom helps small business owners, entrepreneurs, and solopreneurs get featured on leading podcasts so then their prospect they're already listening to. Then he shows them how to turn listeners into customers. So in this interview, we talk about how podcast interviews can help you grow your business, how to get on targeted podcasts, and how to monetize your podcast interviews. You cannot miss it. Make sure that you read the entire show notes if you like reading, or you get extra bonuses at gtex.org.uk/episode iPhone 117. And that's where you can get all the transcript, all the show notes. You can watch the video recording of the interview. So that's all there. And also you can find in the description and in the show notes the link where you can connect with Tom Schwab. Before we start, let me remind you that if you want to make six-figure presentations and become awesome at selling from the stage without compromising your integrity, then I have created for you the ultimate selling from the stage checklist, which is the most comprehensive checklist to create a pitch that sells without selling like a manipulative, sleazy, door-to-door salesperson, right? So you will love it. Make sure that you check the link in the show notes and on our website. Also, make sure that you join our Facebook group because, the journey of an expert is quite lonely. You have to do a lot of things on your own. So your network is what's going to make your journey definitely faster and then more enjoyable. So why don't you join all the experts that we interview on our show, where you can ask them questions. You can also win the opportunity to be featured on our show as well. And you can connect with like-minded people and as well attend all our weekly trainings that we do just for the Facebook group on social media, on how to build your business, how to create events, and many, many, many more. So it's worth joining. It's completely for free. Is our Facebook group. Now, I think that it's time to start the music, shall we? It's time to hear it from our dear Tom Schwab. So, without further ado, let's start the music. Woohoo! Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another awesome episode of Explode Your Expert Biz show. Today, I'm here with the one and only Tom Schwab. How you doing, Tom?
Simone, I am thrilled to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Now, for those of you that don't know Tom, he runs a business called Interview Valley, and he helps small business owners, entrepreneurs, solopreneurs to get featured on leading podcasts so that the podcast that their prospects are already listening to, and then he shows them how to turn their listeners into customers. Which is awesome. I mean, I'm running a podcast myself, so I'm eager to learn here. I'm eager to get into the trenches and learn from Tom. But before we start, Tom, can you share for the next few minutes what got you about yourself and why did you start this business?
Yeah, I guess it starts with the my first job out of college. I ran nuclear power plants in the Navy, and one of the things that I saw there was that anything can be systematized. You know, when people say, "Well, you don't understand my business; it's too complicated," it's like, no. If they can teach 20-year-old high school students how to run a nuclear reactor safely, you can systematize your business, right? And I think too many people focus in it on art and magic, right? So when I looked at sales and marketing and started my own companies, one of the things I looked at is like, let's figure out a system here, a reproducible system in order to attract, engage, and delight customers. And about 8 years ago, started with inbound marketing. There's a company called HubSpot. We were one of their early e-commerce companies, and at that time, content meant blogs. And
Yeah.
over the years, blogs have gotten less efficient. They never were super effective. And then about 4 years ago, we started to say, could you use podcast interviews in order, almost like guest blogs used to be, as an expert to go out there and get in front of your ideal audience, to get them to know, like, and trust you. And Simone, we were just amazed by the results we got with it, and had a lot of clients say, hey, could you do this for me? And I always say the best copy comes from clients. And a client that said, I want to be the guest, you take care of the rest. You know, Sinatra only sang. That's what I want to do. I want to be the performer. So that's what we do. We help authors, speakers, coaches, brands get out there and get in front of their ideal clients, because I believe that almost every business out there, their biggest problem is obscurity, right? They've got something that could help. They could help people if those people just knew about them.
Absolutely. And I mean, if I think about my journey in podcasting, in the podcasting world, it's been exactly for the same reason. I was looking is there must be a better or smarter way to create content. And I found myself listening to a lot of podcasts during my commute every morning. I was listening and binge listening to some podcasts, and I was like, why am I not starting a podcast myself? And I remember that made that changed it. That was a game changer. But then I started thinking, why am I not going on other people's podcasts, which to promote my podcast and my brand and what I do, and that was mind blowing. So, what made you decide podcast instead of blogs or other? You know, you can do guest lives on Facebook Lives. You can
Mhm.
do guest blogging, and you know, I got some good results with guest blogging as well. But why guest podcasting should be the one instead of the others?
Right. And I think the first thing you have to look at is yourself, right? How do you produce content the easiest? So for me, I can write a blog, but it feels like a homework assignment, right? But talking, being interviewed, to me, that's easy, that's fun. Then I can reproduce that into other content. So for me personally, I look at it and say, this is the medium where I communicate best. And I think a lot of times with experts, you know, the speakers, the coaches, people need to hear your voice, need to understand who you are, because they're not so much buying a product service, they're buying a relationship with that person that, hey, I understand you, Simone, and you can help me. You've helped other people. So really you're trying to build that relationship. And so I look at that and say, from that standpoint, that interviews are more powerful than, say, just a blog. Then the flip side too is like, why would you do interviews on other people's podcasts as opposed to starting your own? And I don't think it's an either or, but Simone, I've been on over 1,000 podcast interviews. And when people ask me, why haven't you started your own podcast yet? I'm like, I've been talking about it for years. But honestly, anybody that tells you doing a podcast is easy has either never done it or never done it well. Simone, the work that you put into this, I appreciate. And I always look at that as like return on investment. I think I can get more return on investment of being the guest and being on other people's platforms as opposed to then me starting my own platform.
Yep, I completely agree with you. Is about the long-term results versus short-term gain. You get, I personally believe that when you are a guest, we're talking about public speaking, right, as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you're speaking on someone else's stage, they do the hard work for you, which is running the event, logistic, promoting the event, getting people in the room, creating everything. You rock up and you are the star of the show, you sell your product, and you go home. That's what you do. The same thing, you deliver your interview, you don't have to think about setting up the podcast, the branding, the marketing, the repurposing, taking piece of content here, doing there, getting the assistant to message again the guest, remind people, blah, 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 blah. So you have it is leveraging your time much better. And I agree with you.
Very much. And I love that. I love that idea of podcast being a digital stage. You were so right. That digital stage, if you can let somebody else build the stage for you, it's so much easier to get your expertise out there.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I think that they both work really well. I'm also a big advocate on having your own podcast because that's where people also are going to follow you, and that's where people then they will have, but it requires a lot of work. It requires a team to run it. Is a project, is a full-time project in your business, and then some people decide I think what I love about this interview is that I'm interviewing a lot of people that already have podcasts, while you are saying no, you don't need one. And I think, and I'm hearing some of our listeners saying, oh, thanks God. Right? Because they say, okay, everyone is telling me to run my own podcast, but I can actually make it without doing it, which I love it. So,
and it could be either or. I think you can work your strengths, whatever your passion is behind. But to me, there's a bigger commitment being a podcast host.
absolutely.
You show up regularly, and if you took the summer off, people would notice. If a guest takes the summer off, nobody's going to notice.
I agree with you. Completely agree with you, 100%. And it goes back to what kind of lifestyle do you want to live? What kind of lifestyle and what kind of business do you want to have? And there is not one way that fits every business. You know what's important for you. You know your strength. You know the way we want to run your business. You have the freedom to run it in the way you want. You want to have a podcast? Have a podcast. You don't want to have a podcast? Just having guest interviews? Just have guest interviews. So now let's explore the getting into the right podcasts, because I know as a podcaster myself, and I'm average interviewed about 100 podcasts a year. That's my target of external interviews. Not all podcasts are created equal, right? There is podcast and podcast. So how can someone find the right podcast?
Oh, you're right. And sometimes people ask me, well, how do you get on a podcast? I'm like, well, there's 400,000 podcasts out there. Getting on one is not the problem. Getting on the right one, that's the question you need to be asking. If you want better answers, ask better questions. So really, we look at it, our algorithm looks at 4 things. So the first one is the podcast itself. So look at the popularity and who it's talking to. It could be a big podcast focused on cat juggling or knitting. As a coach or an expert, that's not going to help you. That's not your audience there. So when we go through looking at that, we always say, okay, what's the popularity in iTunes? What's the typical listener of that? We also look and say, how long has this podcast been around? The ugly reality is that most podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. So you really don't want to be guest number 7 when they stop paying the Libsyn bill on number 8 and it's completely lost. So that's the first thing. And I think lots of people look at that, but there's other things you can look at too. And one of them is the website, because the backlinks from a podcast are so powerful. We've got some clients that do podcast guesting just as an SEO strategy.
Yeah.
So you can look at the podcast and say, do they have, what's their popularity, like an Alexa ranking? What's their authority, like a Moz ranking? And that can be very powerful. The third thing is social media. Are they promoting it? How many people are actually going to see this? And then we always look at what have our experience been with previous clients. There are some big podcasts that are so generic that they never seem to convert real well because they're talking to everybody.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can find a podcast that has your ideal listeners in it, man, you'll get the best conversions from that. It's almost like if you're a speaker, do you want to speak in front of 100,000 random people for 5 minutes? No, because you'll tick them off, right? Or would you rather speak to a conference room of 100 or 1,000 ideal customers? Well, the smart experts know that they want to be in front of their ideal customers. So
Sign me up.
sometimes we have to remind people that there's more fish in the ocean, but if you can find a barrel of fish, go there every time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with you. Completely agree with you 100%. Remember, I got a lot of clients going through external podcast interviews, and these podcasts weren't even huge. They weren't huge podcasts. They weren't big names, but I know that my exact avatar was there. So, of course, size matters. We'll say size doesn't matter, but hey, size matter. And if you're being interviewed on a podcast which has 3 listeners, and the 3 listeners are the mom, the dad, and the sister, and the goldfish of the host, then you might not get results from there. But then, as you said, is to look at for how long has your podcast been around. And this is, for example, as well, I'm seeing this as a point of view of a podcast host. When I'm looking for my guests, I had recently Jarek Robbins, which is the son of Tony Robbins, as a guest. We're going to release the episode soon. Now, I didn't approach him up until I had 100 episodes. Because I remember I approached him once, and I was thinking about the 20 episode mark. And your team tore me down. I said, no, your podcast is too fresh. So then I waited up until the 100 episode, and then it was as easy, straight in, yes, you're coming in. So I think that as well, that longevity is crucial from a guest point of view, because it says, are you a host that actually can get me some results?
Mm-hmm. So it's got to work for both people. So from that standpoint, that was a big point for you to be at your 100th episode, and for him to come on after that point sort of takes you to the next level. So all of those things will make the difference between just getting on a podcast and getting business results from a podcast interview.
Absolutely. So now, if I want to, let's say, how do I find the right podcast then? So if I'm going, sometimes when I want to be a guest on a show, I'm going on my iTunes, and I'm flicking on the trending podcasts that there are, and I see if that's relevant. But what other ways can be to find the right show?
Yeah, one of the best ones is to ask your current clients if they listen to podcasts, right? Ask them, hey, do you listen to podcasts? What ones are your favorite ones? Because one of the things that we have found is that it's not always going on the same style of podcasts, but getting in front of your ideal listener. So let me give you an example here, Simone. We had a client early on, great business coach, but when he went on podcasts that were for business coaches, he sounded like every other business coach, right? Everyone was basically the same.
Yeah.
But when he got on a podcast that focused on men's health, middle-aged men, he made a comment and it said, he works with his clients on work-life balance. He said, it does you no good if you make your first million by the age of 30, if you make your first widow by the age of 40. That resonated so well with that audience. It was like the first time a business coach, a life coach, had been in front of that audience. They were open to seeing that. I always use the example. It's almost like walking into a bar. If you're the only woman that walks into that bar, you're going to get noticed. And it was the same thing. He walked into a place where he was different. He was fresh, had fresh ideas. So a lot of times people just start to say, well, I'm selling coaching, or I'm a speaker, so I need to get on speakers podcasts. No, get on the podcast that your ideal listeners are already listening to, and get in front of them there.
I think that's very powerful. And it remarks the fact that your customers have all the answers. Your customers have all the answers all the bloody time.
And with that too, also, I love that line. I've always said that your customer's the only expert. I've got an opinion on my business. You've got an opinion on it,
Hell
but
yeah.
it's an opinion. The customer is the one that's voting, and voting with their dollars. So do more of what they love and do less of what they loathe. So like when you're on a podcast interview, we worked with a client, and he is an accountant, and he does a lot of virtual CFO work. Well, he was getting on different podcasts. We were looking at the data, and after about 4 months, pointed out, hey, did you notice that you do really well on e-commerce podcasts and dentist podcasts? And he's like, a lot of my clients have been that area there. So from that standpoint, it's like for the next 5 months, all we focused on was e-commerce podcasts and dentist podcasts. It was like once we figured out what that barrel of fish was, we just kept going and trying to find different ones there. So I think it's important as you go on podcasts to have some kind of a mechanism in order to understand where your traffic is coming from. Because if some podcasts are giving you base hits, maybe don't go to that type anymore. But if some of them are giving you home runs, well, go back to that podcast and find
Absolutely.
other podcasts just like that.
Absolutely. Great, great, great. Now, I want to then go to the step further. So now we discussed about one of the ways to find guest podcasts. So now you know how to find them. You have an idea on how to find them. But then you are on the show. Now you're the time where you are on the show. And it's important, as you mentioned before, Tom, that you don't sound like everyone else. Somehow you gotta stand out. Somehow you gotta get this listener to say, oh my God, this is the person for me. I want to start an interaction. I want to engage with the person and ultimately maybe buy for this person.
Mm-hmm.
How do you stand out as a guest?
Well, I love this, and I love how you describe it on your website. And you should trademark that line of how not to be a douchebag on a stage, because that is so true. Because a podcast interview is a great place to build credibility, build that know, like, and trust. It's an awful place for an infomercial. And so we do a lot of testing, and digital marketers will always tell you one call to action, right? Just give one call to action. Our testing has consistently shown to give 3 calls to action off of a podcast interview. And I'll pull behind the curtain here and show you, how I use it, and you'll be like, oh, okay, now I get it. So the 3 calls to action are a small yes, a medium yes, and a heck yes. So for me, a lot of times the small yes will be, hey, there's 9 secrets to getting on your first podcast, and there's an infographic for that. I'm not going to go through and list all 9 of them, but I'll tell people, hey, there's this free infographic, and you can go back and get that. And we always make a dedicated welcome page to send traffic back to, and that way we can measure which ones are a base hit, which ones are a home run. So total transparency here. If you go to interviewvalet.com/explode, you will see what a welcome page looks like. And I'll tell you right now, you have no idea what I look like. You have no idea what my website looks like, but you know Simone and you know his podcast. So the first thing you're going to see on there is going to be his picture, right? That's that tacit trust seal, and it cuts down on the bounce rates. And then there'll be some words, and then there'll be the small yes, the medium yes, and the heck yes. So the small yes is just that little infographic. The medium yes is typically, I wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits. You can buy it on Amazon, but I give away more than I sell. So that's always the medium yes. If you want a copy of the book, just go there and you can get a free download of it. And then the big yes, especially for coaches and experts, if somebody hears you and they're like, Simone gets me, he can help me, he's the one. Well, don't slow them down in a sales funnel, right? One of our clients, Bill Troy, wrote a book called Clicksand, How Digital Marketing is Killing Your Business. And one of the points he makes there is big fish don't go through funnels, and whales don't click. So if somebody hears you for 30 or 45 minutes and they want to work with you, don't slow them down. Let them talk with the wizard. So the big yes for us is, hey, if podcast interview marketing sounds like something you would like to learn more about, to leverage, let's jump on a 15-minute discovery call and see how you might use it. So once again, how do you sell from a podcast without being a douchebag? Well, give them ways to help them. So the small yes, here's a checklist. That medium yes, hey, here's a free book. The big yes, where they come ready to engage. Well, let's talk. And do that all through a dedicated welcome page.
This is mind-blowing, I have to say. Hat off, and actually, I love running this show because I get to learn always something new. So you just changed my guest podcast strategy right now.
Yep.
Tomorrow, actually tonight, I'm gonna create that page for my next interviews, like literally straight away. This is such a great thing, in particular because what I loved about is true. The majority of the clients that will pay you the biggest amount of money, they're not going through the funnels. Funnels are for the masses. The straight conversations, I want it, is for the few. And if you get the few through a long funnel, first of all, they ain't got the time to go through it. They ain't got the passion to go through it. They just want the results because their pain is big. Their pain or their desire is strong enough to get them to say, I know this is important for me. I love this. Let's move forward. And that's the same thing, for example, that happens. So my specialty is selling from the stage through seminars. In particular, a small event when we get 15 people in the room and we can make up to $100,000 with 15 people in the room. And when we funnel people through that seminar to get there, we have the first call to action during a presentation, which is to download something. So they might send a text or they might put their name down to get something to download during that presentation. And then there is going to be a stronger call to action towards the end with or the product to buy or the conversation or booking a consultation for having a proper conversation. So that's the same psychology around it. So, which makes sense. Absolutely.
That's a great analogy, and because I've had this argument back and forth with people, and it's like an interview or speaking from a stage. That's not cold traffic. That's not the same thing as traffic off a Facebook ad or traffic off a blog. They've already heard your heart for 30 minutes. So they know more about you than you know about them at that time. So like you said, have the conversation with them.
Exactly. And also on top of that, there is the endorsement and the transference of authority from the guest, from the host of the podcast, which is someone that they already have a relationship with, to you. So now you are already immediately not completely liked and trusted, but half liked and half trusted.